morning sun cast long shadows across the grand estate as black vehicles lined the circular driveway. Camilla stood at her bedroom window, watching through the silk curtains as men in dark suits stepped out of their cars. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her teacup, the delicate china rattling against the saucer. She had known this day would come. The whispers in the palace corridors, the strange looks from staff members, the sudden changes in her daily schedule, all signs that something was brewing behind closed doors. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier to face. The doorbell rang through the vast halls of her private residence, echoing off the marble floors and painted ceilings. Camilla set down her tea and smoothed her silk robe, taking one last look around the room that had been her sanctuary for so many years. The antique furniture, the priceless paintings, the delicate ornaments that held so many memories. Would she ever see them again? Her personal assistant Margaret appeared in the doorway looking pale and worried. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "they're here. The Royal Watch officials. They have papers." Camilla nodded slowly, her royal training kicking in despite her racing heart. She had been taught from childhood how to maintain composure in any situation, how to face crisis with dignity and grace. But this was different. This wasn't a public ceremony or a state dinner where she could smile and wave. This was personal, invasive, and deeply humiliating. "Show them to the library," she said quietly. "I'll be down in 5 minutes." As Margaret disappeared down the hallway, Camilla moved to her dressing room and selected a simple but elegant navy dress. She applied her makeup carefully, each stroke of powder and lipstick an act of defiance against those who sought to strip away her dignity. If they were going to tear apart her life, she would face them looking every inch the queen she had become. The library was her favorite room in the house, filled with first-edition books and comfortable leather chairs where she had spent countless peaceful afternoons. Now it felt cold and formal as 5 men in expensive suits stood waiting for her. Their leader, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward as she entered. "Your Majesty," he said with a slight bow. "I am Inspector Harrison from the Royal Watch Financial Crimes Division. We regret to inform you that we have a warrant to search these premises and confiscate certain items as part of an ongoing investigation." Camilla's throat felt dry, but her voice remained steady. "What exactly are you investigating, Inspector?" "Irregularities in the acquisition and ownership of certain valuable items in your possession," he replied, unfolding an official-looking document. "We have reason to believe that some pieces in your collection may have been obtained through questionable means." The words hit her like a physical blow. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built during her years in the royal family was being called into question. She thought of the beautiful jewelry in her bedroom safe, the artwork that adorned her walls, the precious ornaments that had been gifts from heads of state around the world. "I assure you, Inspector, that every item in my possession was acquired legally and properly documented," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That may be so, Your Majesty, but we must verify the provenance of each piece. This investigation extends beyond your personal collection to items that may have historical significance to the crown." As the morning wore on, Camilla watched helplessly as teams of specialists moved through her home like ants, photographing everything, making lists, wrapping precious items in protective materials. They were gentle but thorough, treating her possessions with professional care while simultaneously violating the privacy of her most intimate spaces. In her bedroom, they opened the hidden safe behind the portrait of her grandmother. Camilla's heart sank as they carefully removed each piece of jewelry, each one carrying a story, a memory, a moment of joy or triumph in her life. The diamond necklace Charles had given her on their first anniversary, the emerald earrings that had belonged to his grandmother, the sapphire brooch she had worn to every major state function. "This is particularly interesting," she heard one of the specialists say as he examined a small wooden box that had been tucked away in the back of the safe. Camilla stepped closer, trying to see what had caught his attention. Inside the box was a collection of items she had almost forgotten about: old letters, small pieces of jewelry, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map on aged paper. The specialist held up the map carefully, studying the faded ink and strange symbols. "Do you know what this is, Your Majesty?" Inspector Harrison asked, appearing at her side. Camilla stared at the map, her mind racing. She remembered the box being given to her years ago by an elderly woman who had worked in the palace for decades. The woman had pressed it into her hands just before retiring, whispering something about keeping it safe for future generations. "I'm not entirely sure," she admitted. "It was given to me by a former palace employee. I believe it's just a family heirloom of some sort." But even as she spoke the words, she could see the excitement in the inspector's eyes. Whatever that map represented, it was clearly more significant than she had realized. The investigation that had begun as an audit of her personal collection was suddenly taking on a much larger scope. As the day drew to a close and the last of the confiscated items were loaded into secure vehicles, Camilla stood in her empty bedroom feeling as though her entire life had been turned upside down. The room that had once been filled with beautiful things now looked bare and sad, with pale rectangles on the walls where paintings had hung, and empty spaces on tables where precious ornaments had sat. But it was the memory of that mysterious map that troubled her most. What secrets had been hiding in her own home all these years? And what would the investigators discover when they began to unravel its mysteries? 3 weeks before the confiscation, Camilla had been enjoying a quiet evening in her study when the phone call came that would change everything. It was her old friend, Lady Catherine Pemberton, calling from her estate in Scotland with news that seemed innocent enough at the time. "Darling," Catherine had said, her voice crackling through the old phone line, "you'll never guess what we found while cleaning out the East Wing. Boxes and boxes of things that belonged to my great-aunt Millicent. You remember her, don't you? She worked at Buckingham Palace for 40 years. Camilla did remember. Millicent Pemberton had been a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, a sharp-eyed woman who seemed to know every secret that passed through the palace walls. She had died 10 years earlier, taking her stories and memories with her to the grave. There are letters, photographs, and the most curious collection of jewelry and artifacts," Catherine continued. "Millicent left specific instructions that if anything happened to her, these items should be given to someone in the royal family who would understand their importance. Your name was at the top of her list." At the time, Camilla had been touched by the gesture. She had always liked Millicent, who had been kind to her during the difficult early years when she was still adjusting to royal life. The idea that the old woman had thought enough of her to entrust her with family treasures felt like a final blessing from someone who had seen it all. The boxes had arrived 2 days later, delivered by Catherine herself during an impromptu visit. They sat in Camilla's private sitting room for a week before she found time to properly examine their contents. When she finally did, she was amazed by what she found. There were pieces of jewelry that looked like they belonged in a museum, ancient brooches with intricate Celtic designs, necklaces that appeared to be from the Victorian era, and rings set with stones she couldn't identify. Each piece was carefully wrapped in soft cloth and accompanied by a small card written in Millicent's neat handwriting, describing where and when she had acquired it. "Gift from the Duchess of York. Christmas 1987, read one card attached to a stunning pearl bracelet. "Found in the Queen Mother's private collection, believed to be from Queen Victoria's personal jewelry box," said another, tied to an ornate silver locket. But it was the documents that proved most intriguing. There were letters written by various members of the royal family dating back decades, photographs of private moments that had never been seen by the public, and detailed notes about the history and significance of different palace artifacts. At the bottom of the largest box, wrapped in a piece of faded silk, was the wooden box that would later catch the attention of the Royal Watch investigators. Inside, along with the mysterious map, were items that seemed to tell a story Camilla couldn't quite piece together. A key that looked centuries old, a small compass with strange markings, and a leather journal filled with entries in multiple handwritings. The journal was perhaps the most fascinating discovery. The entries spanned several decades and appeared to be written by different people, all documenting what seemed to be a long-running effort to hide and protect certain royal treasures. The earliest entries were from the 1940s, written in a shaky hand that spoke of dark times and the need to keep the crown's most precious secrets safe from those who would exploit them. Camilla had spent hours reading through the journal, trying to understand what she had stumbled upon. The writer spoke in code much of the time, referring to locations by numbers and using symbols instead of names. But gradually a picture began to emerge of a secret network of palace employees who had been quietly moving and hiding valuable items for decades. The map that had caught the investigators' attention appeared to show the locations where these items had been hidden. It was hand-drawn on what looked like very old paper, with careful markings indicating spots throughout London and the surrounding countryside. Some locations were marked with symbols that corresponded to entries in the journal, while others had numbers that seemed to reference a coding system Camilla couldn't crack. What troubled her most was a recurring theme in the journal entries about items that had been liberated from the palace during times of crisis. The writers seemed to believe they were protecting these treasures from being lost or destroyed, but their methods were clearly questionable. Some entries suggested that valuable items had been quietly removed from official inventories and hidden away for safekeeping. One entry, dated 1953, had particularly caught her attention. The coronation has provided excellent cover for our activities. 3 more pieces have been secured and moved to location 7. The Queen will never miss them among all the ceremony and celebration. We are the true guardians of the crown's heritage. Camilla had felt a chill reading those words. If the journal was to be believed, there had been a systematic effort by palace insiders to steal royal treasures over the course of many decades. And now, through Millicent's bequest, she had become the unwitting recipient of the fruits of these activities. She had considered turning everything over to the authorities immediately, but something held her back. The people who had written these journal entries clearly believed they were doing the right thing. Many of the entries spoke of protecting items from being sold off during financial difficulties, or preventing them from falling into the wrong hands during political upheavals. Moreover, some of the items in her possession had legitimate provenance. The letters and photographs were clearly family heirlooms that Millicent had every right to possess and pass on. The jewelry pieces, with clear documentation showing they had been gifts or legitimate purchases, were obviously hers to keep. It was the items connected to the map and journal that posed the real problem. If these treasures had indeed been taken from the royal collection without permission, then possessing them made her an unwitting accomplice to historical theft. But if they had been saved from genuine threats and hidden for legitimate reasons, then the people responsible might have been unsung heroes rather than criminals. The weight of this moral dilemma had been keeping her awake at night for weeks before the investigators arrived. She had been planning to seek advice from trusted legal counsel about how to handle the situation when the decision was taken out of her hands. Now, sitting in her empty bedroom with most of her possessions gone, Camilla realized that her hesitation had been a mistake. Perhaps if she had been more proactive about addressing the questionable items, she could have avoided this humiliating public investigation. But it was too late for regrets now. The investigators had everything, the legitimate treasures alongside the suspicious ones, the innocent family photographs mixed in with potentially damaging historical documents. Her reputation, carefully built over decades of public service, was now at the mercy of whatever secrets Millicent's collection might reveal. As she prepared for bed in her stripped-down bedroom, Camilla couldn't help but wonder how many other palace employees over the years had been part of this mysterious network. How many other families might be sitting on collections of questionable royal artifacts, not knowing the true history of their inheritances, and most importantly, what would happen when the investigators followed the map to its various marked locations? What treasures might they find hidden away in secret places around London? And what stories would those discoveries tell about the hidden history of the British monarchy? Inspector Harrison sat in his cramped office at Royal Watch headquarters, surrounded by evidence boxes and photographs that covered every available surface. The investigation into Camilla's possessions had grown far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and the pressure from his superiors was mounting daily. The mysterious map had proven to be the key that unlocked decades of hidden secrets. Working with a team of historical experts and code breakers, they had managed to decipher most of the symbols and locations marked on the aged paper. What they were discovering was reshaping their understanding of royal history and challenging everything they thought they knew about the palace's internal security. The first location, marked on the map, had led them to a storage facility in South London, rented under the name of a company that hadn't existed for 30 years. Inside a climate-controlled unit, they found dozens of carefully packed items that clearly belonged in the royal collection. Silver serving pieces bearing the royal coat of arms, paintings that had been listed as missing from palace inventories, and jewelry that matched descriptions from historical records. Each item was meticulously documented with labels indicating when and why it had been moved. The pattern that emerged told a story of dedicated palace employees, who had spent decades quietly removing valuable items during times of political uncertainty, financial strain, or when they believed the objects were at risk of being damaged or sold. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the royal historian brought in to assess the finds, was both fascinated and horrified by what the investigation was revealing. She had spent her career studying the royal collection, and many of the items they were discovering had been on her list of missing or lost treasures. This changes everything we thought we knew about the palace's inventory management, she explained to Inspector Harrison as they examined a particularly stunning emerald tiara that had been missing since 1968. According to official records, this piece was destroyed in a fire. But here it is, perfectly preserved and clearly cared for. The journal found in Camilla's possession was proving to be an invaluable guide to understanding the motivations behind what appeared to be a massive, long-term operation. The entries revealed a network of palace employees who saw themselves as guardians of Britain's cultural heritage, working to protect irreplaceable artifacts from various threats. One entry from 1973 provided chilling insight into their methods. The financial crisis is worsening, and there are rumors that valuable items may need to be sold to foreign collectors to raise funds. We cannot allow this to happen. The crown jewels of England belong to the people of England, not to private collectors in America or Japan. Location 12 has been secured, and 3 more pieces have been moved to safety. Another entry from 1982 was equally revealing. Security at the palace has been compromised following the recent break-in. We have identified several items that could be targeted by thieves or foreign agents. Better that these treasures remain hidden and safe than risk them falling into enemy hands. As the investigation expanded, Inspector Harrison found himself grappling with complex questions about loyalty, theft, and the greater good. Were these palace employees criminals who had stolen priceless artifacts for personal gain, or were they patriots who had risked their careers and freedom to protect Britain's cultural heritage during times of crisis? The evidence suggested the latter. Every item they had discovered was carefully preserved and documented, stored in conditions designed to prevent deterioration. There was no indication that any of the treasures had been sold or traded for personal profit. Instead, the network seemed to have functioned as an unofficial insurance policy against the loss of irreplaceable historical artifacts. But the legal implications were staggering. If the investigation proved that royal employees had systematically removed items from the official collection, it would represent one of the largest theft cases in British history. The fact that their motives appeared to be protective rather than criminal didn't change the fact that they had taken property that didn't belong to them. The second location on the map led them to a bank vault in the City of London, rented under the name of a trust that had been established in the 1950s. Inside, they found what appeared to be a complete backup collection of coronation regalia, crowns, scepters, and ceremonial objects that were nearly identical to the official crown jewels housed in the Tower of London. Dr. Hartwell was stunned by the discovery. "These aren't replicas," she told the investigation team. "These are the original backup pieces that were made in case anything happened to the primary crown jewels during World War II. According to official records, they were melted down for their gold and precious stones in 1947, but clearly, someone decided they were too valuable to destroy. The vault also contained detailed records explaining the reasoning behind each preservation decision. The documents revealed that the network had been particularly active during periods of social unrest, economic crisis, and international tension. They had apparently viewed themselves as the last line of defense against the loss of Britain's cultural heritage. One file contained correspondence between network members discussing the sale of royal artifacts to private collectors during the 1970s financial crisis. The letters showed deep concern about irreplaceable items leaving the country forever, and detailed plans to secretly preserve copies or alternative pieces that could eventually be rediscovered and returned to the official collection. They weren't just taking things, Inspector Harrison realized as he read through the files. They were building a shadow collection, a hidden backup of Britain's most important cultural artifacts. The third location marked on the map proved to be the most significant discovery yet. Hidden beneath the floorboards of a seemingly ordinary house in Richmond, they found a cache of documents that appeared to chronicle the secret history of the monarchy itself. letters between royal family members discussing controversial decisions, photographs of private moments that revealed the human side of public figures, and detailed records of palace finances and expenditures that had never been made public. Among these documents was a letter dated 1997 that made Inspector Harrison's blood run cold. Written by someone with apparent inside knowledge of palace operations, it discussed concerns about the security of certain artifacts following the death of Princess Diana and the massive public interest in royal possessions that followed. The situation has become untenable, the letter read. Public fascination with royal memorabilia has reached dangerous levels, and we have intelligence suggesting that several items may be targeted for theft. The network must accelerate its preservation activities to ensure that these irreplaceable pieces remain safe. Proter. Letter went on to detail specific items that were considered at risk and outlined plans for their protection. Many of these items were now in the possession of the royal watch, having been confiscated from Camilla's residence. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Camilla had been an unwitting recipient of decades of accumulated treasures. The network had apparently decided that she was trustworthy enough to serve as a temporary guardian for their preserved collection, perhaps planning to eventually reveal the full extent of their activities when the time was right. But something had gone wrong. Either someone had betrayed the network's existence, or their activities had been discovered through other means. Now their carefully preserved collection was scattered across evidence rooms and storage facilities, while the very person they had trusted to protect it faced potential criminal charges. Inspector Harrison found himself in an impossible position. His investigation had uncovered what was arguably the most significant cultural preservation effort in British history, but it had been carried out through methods that were clearly illegal. The network members had broken laws and violated trust, but they had also saved treasures that might otherwise have been lost forever. As he prepared his preliminary report for his superiors, Inspector Harrison couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if the network had never existed. How many priceless artifacts would have been sold, stolen, or destroyed over the decades? How much of Britain's cultural heritage would have been lost to private collectors or foreign governments? The investigation was far from over, but already it was clear that the case would force the royal establishment to confront uncomfortable questions about security, preservation, and the true cost of protecting cultural heritage in an uncertain world. The breakthrough came when Dr. Hartwell discovered a hidden compartment in one of the recovered storage boxes. Inside was a leather-bound ledger that served as the network's complete operational history, dating back to 1943. The first entry was written in a careful script by someone identified only as Guardian 1, and it revealed the true origins of what would become decades of secret preservation activities. The bombing of Buckingham Palace has made clear the vulnerability of our national treasures, the entry began. Last night's raid destroyed 3 irreplaceable artifacts from the Queen Mother's personal collection, and we can no longer assume that remaining in the palace guarantees safety. A small group of us have agreed that desperate times require desperate measures. The ledger revealed that the network had been born during World War II, when palace employees watched helplessly as bombing raids destroyed priceless artifacts that had survived for centuries. What began as an emergency response to wartime destruction had gradually evolved into a sophisticated operation, spanning multiple generations of palace staff. Guardian 1 was identified in later entries as James Whitmore, head of palace security from 1942 to 1967. His initial co-conspirators included Elizabeth Morrison, senior lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, and Thomas Hartley, the palace's chief curator. Together they established the protocols and codes that would guide the network's activities for the next 70 years. The early entries painted a picture of dedicated employees making agonizing decisions about which artifacts to risk losing and which to secretly preserve. They had watched valuable items be sold during financial crises, seen irreplaceable pieces damaged by careless handling, and witnessed the gradual erosion of security measures that left treasures vulnerable to theft. "We are not thieves," wrote Guardian 1 in a 1945 entry. "We are custodians of a heritage that belongs to future generations. History will judge whether our actions were justified, but we cannot stand by and watch these treasures be lost to short-sighted decisions or inadequate protection." Dr. Hartwell was particularly fascinated by the network's sophisticated organization. They had established multiple safe houses, maintained detailed inventories, and developed elaborate systems for documenting the provenance and condition of each preserved item. Most remarkably, they had planned for continuity across generations, carefully recruiting new members and training them in the network's methods and philosophies. Millicent Pemberton, the lady-in-waiting who had ultimately passed the collection to Camilla, had been Guardian 7 according to the ledger. Her entries, spanning from 1963 to 2010, provided insight into how the network had adapted to changing times and new threats to the royal collection. The 1970s economic crisis has forced difficult decisions, she wrote in 1974. Official discussions about selling portions of the collection to private collectors have reached an alarming level. We have identified 12 pieces that are particularly at risk and have made arrangements for their protection. The Queen herself is not aware of these sales discussions, but certain advisors seem willing to sacrifice historical artifacts for short-term financial relief. Another entry from 1982 revealed the network's response to the famous Buckingham Palace security breach when an intruder managed to reach the Queen's bedroom. The security failures have exposed weaknesses we have long suspected, Millicent wrote. Foreign intelligence services are actively seeking to acquire British cultural artifacts, both through theft and through legal purchase. We have accelerated our preservation timeline and moved an additional 15 pieces to secure locations. The ledger also contained detailed personality assessments of royal family members, evaluating their commitment to preserving cultural heritage and their trustworthiness regarding the network's activities. The entries revealed a complex web of loyalties and concerns that painted the royal family in very human terms. One entry about the current king, written when he was still Prince of Wales, showed particular insight. Charles demonstrates genuine appreciation for historical artifacts and has expressed private concerns about the commercial pressures facing the collection. However, his position makes him vulnerable to political influences that might compromise preservation efforts. He would likely support our goals but cannot be informed of our methods. The assessment of Camilla was equally revealing. The Duchess has shown remarkable sensitivity to the historical significance of royal artifacts and has privately expressed frustration with what she perceives as inadequate preservation efforts. Her background outside the royal family provides useful perspective on the collection's cultural importance. She may be suitable for future involvement. As Inspector Harrison read through decades of carefully recorded observations and decisions, he began to understand the network's evolution from emergency wartime response to systematic cultural preservation effort. The members had genuinely believed they were protecting Britain's heritage from threats that ranged from wartime destruction to political interference to simple bureaucratic negligence. The financial records contained in the ledger were particularly illuminating. The network had funded their activities through a combination of private donations from wealthy supporters, careful investments, and occasionally through the sale of duplicate or damaged items that they deemed less historically significant. Every transaction was meticulously recorded, and the proceeds were always reinvested in preservation activities. One particularly poignant section detailed the network's response to the fire at Windsor Castle in 1992, while official restoration efforts focused on the most visible damage. Network members had quietly worked to save artifacts that might otherwise have been written off as total losses. They had restored damaged pieces using traditional techniques and preserved them in climate-controlled storage, while official records listed them as destroyed. The fire has provided both crisis and opportunity, Millicent had written. 17 pieces that were officially listed as lost have been successfully preserved and restored. Future generations will thank us for these efforts, even if current authorities cannot appreciate their necessity. Dr. Hartwell discovered that the network had also served an educational function, carefully documenting the history and significance of each preserved item. Their records were often more complete and accurate than official palace inventories, providing details about provenance, cultural significance, and historical context that had been lost or forgotten in official documentation. The ledger revealed that the network had operated with remarkable restraint, focusing exclusively on preservation rather than profit. There was no evidence of any member ever selling artifacts for personal gain or using their access for financial benefit. Instead, they had invested their own money and time in protecting items they believed were insufficiently valued by official channels. Most surprising was the discovery that the network had maintained detailed succession plans, ensuring that their activities could continue even if key members died or retired. They had identified potential future guardians years in advance, carefully evaluating candidates based on their access, expertise, and commitment to preservation values. Camilla's selection as a guardian had been under consideration for over a decade, according to the records. The network had observed her growing influence within the royal family and her demonstrated respect for historical artifacts. They had viewed her as someone who could potentially bridge the gap between their underground preservation efforts and official royal collection management. The final entries in the ledger, written by Millicent shortly before her death, revealed the network's growing concern about their own future. "We are aging," she wrote, "and the new generation of palace employees seems less connected to the historical significance of our work. The decision to entrust our collection to external guardians may be necessary to ensure continuation of our mission." As Inspector Harrison closed the ledger, he realized that the investigation had uncovered something far more complex than a simple theft case. The network had operated for 70 years without detection, preserving hundreds of artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. Their methods were questionable, but their results were undeniably impressive. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. The legal case against Camilla was complicated by the fact that she had unknowingly become the guardian of a historically significant preservation effort. The network members were guilty of theft under the law, but they had also performed an invaluable service to British cultural heritage. Whatever decision was made, it would set precedents that would affect how similar cases were handled in the future, and determine the fate of one of the most successful underground preservation efforts in modern history. As news of the investigation leaked to the media, unexpected voices began to emerge from across Britain and beyond. People who had worked in royal households decades earlier, descendants of palace employees, and even members of the extended royal family started coming forward with their own stories about the mysterious network and the treasures it had preserved. The first call came to Inspector Harrison's office on a rainy Tuesday morning. Margaret Wells, an 84-year-old former palace housemaid, had seen the news reports and wanted to share what she knew about her grandmother's involvement with the preservation efforts. "My grandmother, Sarah Morrison, worked as a lady-in-waiting for 40 years, Margaret explained in a trembling voice. "Before she died in 1987, she told me stories about a secret group that was protecting royal treasures from being sold or stolen. I thought they were just the ramblings of an old woman, but seeing those photographs in the newspaper, I recognized some of those pieces." Margaret's testimony provided the first personal account of how the network had operated from the perspective of someone who had lived through it. Her grandmother had been one of the founding members, working alongside Millicent Pemberton to carefully document and preserve items they believed were at risk. "Grandmother always said they weren't stealing," Margaret continued. "They were saving things for the future. She used to tell me about watching beautiful artifacts being damaged by careless handling, or seeing valuable pieces disappear into private collections where the public would never see them again. It broke her heart." The phone calls continued throughout the week. Thomas Hartley Jr., son of the network's original curator, contacted the investigation team with a box of his father's personal papers that included detailed sketches and descriptions of preserved artifacts. The drawings showed the loving care with which the network had documented each piece, noting every detail of craftsmanship and historical significance. "My father never spoke directly about his work with the group," Thomas explained during his interview with Inspector Harrison. "But I found these papers after he died, along with a letter explaining that he had spent his career trying to protect Britain's cultural heritage from those who didn't understand its true value. He was proud of what they had accomplished." Perhaps the most moving testimony came from Elena Vasquez, a conservator who had unknowingly worked on several of the preserved pieces during the 1990s. She had been hired through a private conservation company to restore damaged artifacts, never knowing that the items belonged to the royal collection. "The pieces I worked on were absolutely extraordinary," she told Dr. Hartwell during an emotional interview. "The quality of craftsmanship was museum level. and many showed damage that suggested they had been through traumatic events: fire damage, water damage, impact damage. Someone had gone to enormous expense to have them properly restored. Elena's records showed that the network had spent hundreds of thousands of pounds over the years on professional conservation work, ensuring that preserved artifacts were maintained to the highest standards. They had employed experts from around the world, always through intermediaries who concealed the true ownership of the pieces. The emotional weight of the investigation became clear when Camilla herself was allowed to review some of the personal stories that had emerged. Sitting in a legal conference room with her lawyers, she read through letters and testimonials from families whose ancestors had been part of the preservation network. One letter particularly touched her. It was from the widow of a palace guard who had helped transport artifacts to safe houses during the 1970s. The woman described how her late husband had considered it the most important work of his life, even though he could never speak about it publicly. Robert came home exhausted many nights, but he always said he was doing something that mattered, the letter read. Years later, when we would visit museums and see displays of royal artifacts, he would point to certain pieces and whisper to me that he had helped keep similar treasures safe. He never told me the details, but I could see the pride in his eyes. Dr. Hartwell found herself particularly moved by the discovery of personal items that had been preserved alongside the official artifacts. Mixed in with the crown jewels and priceless artwork were simple objects that had clearly held emotional significance for royal family members. A child's drawing signed by a young Prince William, a pressed flower from Princess Diana's wedding bouquet, a handwritten recipe in the Queen Mother's distinctive script. These intimate items revealed the human side of the network's preservation efforts. They hadn't just saved officially valuable artifacts, they had protected the personal memories and emotional connections that made the royal collection meaningful to the people who lived with it. Daily, the investigation also uncovered evidence of the network's efforts to preserve items connected to tragic events in royal history. They had carefully preserved artifacts from Princess Diana's apartments, apparently recognizing their historical significance long before official channels acknowledged their importance. Similarly, they had protected personal items belonging to other royal family members who had died, young or under difficult circumstances. One particularly poignant discovery was a collection of children's toys that had belonged to the Queen's younger children during the 1960s. The network had preserved them when they were being cleared out during a palace renovation, apparently believing that future historians would value these glimpses into the private lives of royal children. It shows they understood that history isn't just about crowns and ceremony, Dr. Hartwell explained to Inspector Harrison. They recognized that the small, personal items often tell us more about real life than the grand state treasures. The investigation revealed that the network had also served as informal counselors and confidants for royal family members who were struggling with the pressure of public life. Several preserved letters showed that network members had provided emotional support and practical advice to royals dealing with personal crises. One series of letters from the 1980s documented the network's efforts to support a young royal family member who was struggling with mental health issues. The correspondence showed remarkable sensitivity and understanding, with network members serving as trusted advisors who could provide support without the complications of official channels. The emotional impact of these discoveries was not lost on Camilla. Reading through decades of preserved correspondence and personal items, she began to understand that she had been entrusted with more than just valuable objects. She had become the guardian of the royal family's emotional history, the keeper of memories and experiences that would otherwise have been lost to time. In a private moment with her legal team, Camilla broke down as she read a letter written by the Queen Mother shortly before her death. The letter, preserved by Millicent Pemberton, expressed the Queen Mother's gratitude for the quiet dedication of palace employees who had served the family for decades without recognition or reward. They have given their lives to protecting not just our possessions, but our heritage and our memories, the Queen Mother had written. History will not record their names, but their service has been invaluable to the continuation of our traditions and the preservation of our family's story. The discovery of such personal items added new complexity to the legal case against Camilla. How could she be prosecuted for possessing items that had been preserved out of love and loyalty? How could the network members be condemned for actions that had clearly been motivated by genuine care for the royal family's welfare? As public awareness of the network's activities grew, support for Camilla began to emerge from unexpected quarters. Museum directors, historians, and cultural preservation experts started speaking out about the value of the network's work and questioning whether criminal prosecution was the appropriate response to their activities. The emotional stories continued to pour in, each one adding new layers to the understanding of what the network had accomplished. Far from being a criminal conspiracy, their activities had been a labor of love spanning multiple generations, driven by genuine concern for preserving Britain's cultural heritage and the royal family's personal history. The question now was whether the legal system could find a way to honor that dedication while still addressing the legitimate concerns about unauthorized removal of royal property. The fate of Camilla and the legacy of the preservation network hung in the balance, with both sides preparing for what promised to be one of the most emotionally charged legal battles in recent royal history. The legal battle that emerged from the investigation divided public opinion like few royal scandals in recent memory. On one side stood those who viewed the network's activities as an elaborate theft operation that had violated the sacred trust between the monarchy and its employees. On the other were those who saw the preservation efforts as a heroic attempt to protect Britain's cultural heritage from bureaucratic neglect and political interference. Sir Jonathan Pembroke, the Crown's chief prosecutor, argued forcefully that intent was irrelevant when dealing with the unauthorized removal of royal property. During the preliminary hearings, he presented evidence showing that hundreds of artifacts had been taken from the royal collection without permission, regardless of the preservation motives involved. "The law is clear," he stated in his opening remarks. "Taking property that belongs to another without permission constitutes theft. The Crown cannot be expected to tolerate systematic removal of its possessions, no matter how noble the stated intentions. If we allow this behavior to go unpunished, we establish a dangerous precedent that could encourage future theft under the guise of protection." Sir Jonathan's case was methodical and damning. He presented detailed inventories showing exactly which items had been removed, when they had disappeared from official records, and how their unauthorized preservation had deprived the royal collection of artifacts that should have been available for public display and scholarly study. The prosecution also argued that the network's secrecy had prevented proper conservation efforts and scholarly research that could have benefited the public understanding of royal history. By hiding artifacts in private storage facilities, they had essentially stolen not just objects but also knowledge and cultural access from the British people. However, Camilla's defense team, led by the formidable barrister Dame Catherine Wright, presented a dramatically different narrative. They argued that Camilla had been an innocent recipient of a well-intentioned cultural preservation effort, and that prosecuting her would criminalize the very people who had worked hardest to protect Britain's heritage. "My client did not steal these artifacts," Dame Catherine argued during one particularly dramatic court session. "She was entrusted with them by people who had spent their lives serving the royal family and protecting the very treasures that are now at the center of this case. To prosecute her is to punish someone for being deemed trustworthy by some of the most dedicated palace employees in modern history." The defense team's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than denying the facts of the case, they reframed the entire narrative around questions of loyalty, service, and the greater good. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the inadequate preservation conditions in royal properties during various periods, the documented instances of artifacts being damaged or lost through official negligence, and the genuine threats to cultural heritage that the network had been responding to. Dr. Hartwell, despite her role in the investigation, found herself testifying primarily for the defense. Her expertise in royal collection management allowed her to provide context about the genuine preservation challenges that had motivated the network's activities. During the 1970s financial crisis, she testified, official palace records show that serious consideration was given to selling significant portions of the royal collection to private collectors. Many of the items preserved by the network were on lists of pieces that could potentially be sold. Their preservation may have literally saved these artifacts for the British people. The public reaction to the trial was intense and deeply divided. Newspapers took strong editorial positions on both sides, with tabloids generally supporting Camilla, while broadsheets were more critical of the network's unauthorized activities. Social media erupted with passionate debates about the proper balance between legal authority and cultural preservation. A particularly influential voice emerged in the form of Professor James Morrison, a historian at Oxford who had spent decades studying royal collection management. His testimony provided crucial context about the historical precedents for the network's activities. What people must understand, Professor Morrison explained to a packed courtroom, is that this network was responding to genuine institutional failures. The royal collection has faced numerous threats over the decades, not just from external forces like thieves and foreign agents, but from internal decisions that prioritized short-term considerations over long-term preservation. The professor's research had uncovered official documents showing that palace administrators had indeed considered selling artifacts during various financial crises, had failed to provide adequate security during certain periods, and had sometimes made decisions about collection management based on political rather than cultural considerations. Public support for Camilla began to build as more details emerged about the network's careful preservation methods and their obvious dedication to protecting rather than profiting from royal artifacts. Petitions demanding the charges be dropped gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures, while prominent cultural figures began speaking out in support of the defense. The Archbishop of Canterbury surprised many by issuing a statement that appeared to support the network's activities. "There are times," he wrote, "when higher moral obligations may conflict with strict legal requirements. Those who work to preserve our cultural heritage, even through unauthorized means, were serving a cause that transcends narrow legal definitions." Even more surprising was the support that emerged from within the royal family itself. While official palace statements remained neutral, several former palace employees came forward to testify about conversations they had had with royal family members who had expressed private gratitude for the network's preservation efforts. One particularly dramatic moment came when Lady Catherine Pemberton, who had originally passed Millicent's collection to Camilla, testified about a conversation she had had with the Queen Mother years earlier. According to Lady Catherine, the Queen Mother had been aware of preservation activities and had tacitly approved of efforts to protect vulnerable artifacts. "She told me that she would rather see treasures safely hidden than properly lost," Lady Catherine testified. The Queen Mother understood that there were threats to the collection that couldn't always be addressed through official channels. The prosecution struggled to counter the emotional weight of such testimony. Sir Jonathan's team found themselves in the uncomfortable position of arguing that following the law was more important than protecting cultural heritage, a position that became increasingly difficult to maintain as more evidence emerged about the genuine preservation challenges the network had faced. Public opinion shifted further in Camilla's favor when documents were released showing the extensive investments the network had made in professional conservation services. Rather than simply hoarding artifacts, they had spent enormous sums ensuring that preserved items were maintained to museum standards. Many pieces had actually been in better condition when recovered than they would have been if they had remained in official palace storage. The trial also revealed interesting divisions within the establishment itself. While prosecutors pushed for criminal convictions, several government ministers began expressing private concerns about the wisdom of pursuing charges against people who had clearly been motivated by patriotic rather than criminal intentions. The media coverage became increasingly sympathetic to Camilla as details emerged about her genuine surprise at discovering the true nature of Millicent's bequest. Court documents showed that she had been planning to seek legal advice about the questionable items before the investigation began, undermining arguments that she had been attempting to conceal stolen property. International attention also began to focus on the case, with museums and cultural preservation organizations around the world expressing interest in the legal precedents that would be established. Many argued that the case highlighted the need for better systems to protect cultural heritage during times of institutional uncertainty. The emotional climax of the trial came when Camilla herself took the stand. Her testimony was dignified and moving, describing her shock at discovering the true nature of her inheritance and her genuine desire to see the artifacts properly preserved and returned to appropriate custody. "I never wanted to possess stolen Property, she testified, fighting back tears. When I realized what I had been given, I wanted to do the right thing. But I also couldn't help but be moved by the dedication and love that these palace employees had shown for protecting our shared heritage. They weren't criminals. They were guardians. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, it became clear that the case had evolved far beyond questions of guilt and innocence. It had become a national conversation about the proper balance between legal authority and moral obligation, between institutional protocol and cultural preservation. The final arguments would determine not just Camilla's fate, but also establish precedents that would affect how similar cases were handled in the future, and how society balanced competing obligations to law, heritage, and the greater good. The judge's decision came on a gray October morning, 6 months after the trial had begun. Justice Eleanor Whitfield, known for her careful consideration of complex legal cases, had clearly wrestled with the unprecedented nature of the charges and the broader implications of her ruling. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with representatives from museums, historical societies, legal organizations, and members of the public who had followed the case with intense interest. Camilla sat quietly in the dock, surrounded by her legal team, while photographers and journalists filled every available space. This case has required the court to consider fundamental questions about the relationship between law, morality, and cultural preservation, Justice Whitfield began, while the facts of unauthorized removal of royal property are not in dispute. The context and motivations surrounding these actions present extraordinary circumstances that demand careful judicial consideration. The judge's analysis was thorough and nuanced. She acknowledged that the network had indeed taken property without authorization, meeting the technical definition of theft under British law. However, she also recognized the unique circumstances that had motivated their actions and the demonstrable benefits that had resulted from their preservation efforts. The evidence shows that the defendants were motivated not by personal gain but by genuine concern for the preservation of irreplaceable cultural artifacts, Justice Whitfield continued. Their methods were unauthorized, but their results were remarkable. Hundreds of artifacts that might otherwise have been lost, damaged, or sold to private collectors have been preserved for future generations. The judge's ruling was as creative as it was just. Rather than imposing criminal penalties, she established what became known as the Camilla precedent, a legal framework that acknowledged the legitimacy of unauthorized preservation efforts while also protecting the rights of property owners. Camilla was found guilty of possession of stolen property, but received a conditional discharge, meaning she would face no punishment provided she complied with the court's directions regarding the artifacts. More importantly, the judge ruled that the preservation network's activities, while technically illegal, had served the public interest in such a significant way that criminal prosecution would be inappropriate. The court finds that prosecuting elderly palace employees who spent decades protecting Britain's cultural heritage would serve no useful purpose and would represent a miscarriage of justice, Justice Whitfield declared. Their actions, while unauthorized, demonstrated a level of dedication and expertise that official channels failed to provide. The most innovative aspect of the ruling was the establishment of the Heritage Protection Trust, a new legal entity that would serve as the official guardian of the preserved artifacts. Rather than simply returning everything to the royal collection, the judge created a system that would ensure proper preservation, public access, and scholarly research while acknowledging the complex ownership questions raised by the case. Camilla was appointed as the first chairman of the Heritage Protection Trust, a role that recognized both her inadvertent involvement in the preservation efforts and her demonstrated commitment to cultural heritage. The trust would operate under joint oversight from the royal household, the British Museum, and the National Gallery, ensuring that preserved artifacts would be properly maintained and made available for public benefit. The ruling also established provisions for recognizing the contributions of network members who were still alive. Rather than facing criminal charges, they were offered positions as consultants to the Heritage Protection Trust, allowing their expertise and historical knowledge to benefit future preservation efforts. The public reaction to the judgment was overwhelmingly positive. Even newspapers that had initially criticized the network's activities praised the judge's wisdom in finding a solution that honored both legal principles and cultural preservation values. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement calling the ruling a triumph of wisdom over rigid legalism. Dr. Hartwell was appointed as the Trust's chief curator, a position that allowed her to continue the scholarly work of documenting and preserving the artifacts, while also ensuring they would be properly integrated into Britain's cultural institutions. Her first major project was a comprehensive exhibition that would tell the story of the preservation network alongside displays of the artifacts they had saved. The exhibition, titled Hidden Guardians: 70 Years of Cultural Preservation, opened at the British Museum 6 months after the trial concluded. It was an immediate sensation, attracting visitors from around the world who came to see both the preserved artifacts and the documentation of the remarkable network that had protected them. One of the most moving displays featured personal items that had been preserved alongside the official artifacts, the children's toys, handwritten letters, and family photographs that had revealed the human side of royal life. These intimate objects, displayed with appropriate sensitivity, provided visitors with unprecedented insights into the private lives of the royal family across several decades. The exhibition also honored the memory of network members who had died before the investigation concluded. A special memorial section featured photographs and biographical information about people like James Whitmore, Elizabeth Morrison, and Millicent Pemberton, acknowledging their contributions to British cultural preservation. Perhaps most remarkably, several living members of the royal family attended the exhibition's opening ceremony. While they could not publicly endorse the network's unauthorized activities, their presence sent a clear signal that they recognized and appreciated the dedication shown by palace employees who had worked to protect the family's heritage. The Prince of Wales, now King, gave a speech that carefully balanced acknowledgement of the network's achievements with respect for legal processes. "We are grateful to all those who have worked to preserve our cultural heritage," he said. "While we must always respect proper legal procedures, we also recognize that dedication to preservation sometimes requires difficult decisions and personal sacrifices." Camilla's role as chairman of the Heritage Protection Trust became one of the most fulfilling positions of her later life. Working with curators, historians, and preservation experts, she helped establish new standards for cultural heritage protection that balanced security needs with public access and scholarly research. The trust also became a model for other institutions facing similar challenges. Museums and cultural organizations around the world began implementing heritage protection protocols based on the lessons learned from the Royal Preservation Network. These protocols provided legal frameworks for protecting cultural artifacts during times of institutional uncertainty while maintaining appropriate oversight and accountability. One of the Trust's most important innovations was the establishment of a cultural heritage emergency response team, staffed by experts who could quickly assess and protect artifacts during natural disasters, political upheavals, or other crisis situations. This team, funded jointly by the government and private donations, became a model for international heritage protection efforts. The investigation had one final, unexpected benefit. The detailed documentation work required for the trial led to the most comprehensive inventory of royal artifacts ever undertaken. This inventory became the foundation for a new digital archive that made information about the royal collection available to scholars and the public in unprecedented ways. 5 years after the trial concluded, Camilla published a memoir titled The Accidental Guardian that told the full story of her involvement with the Preservation Network. The book became a bestseller, with proceeds donated to cultural preservation charities around the world. In it, she reflected on the extraordinary experience of discovering she had been entrusted with decades of secretly preserved treasures. Learned that sometimes the most important acts of service happen in silence, she wrote. The men and women who preserved these artifacts asked for no recognition and expected no reward. They simply understood that some things are too valuable to lose, and they were willing to take personal risks to ensure that future generations would inherit the treasures of the past. The Preservation Network's legacy continued to influence cultural heritage protection long after the trial ended. The Camilla precedent was cited in similar cases around the world, and the Heritage Protection Trust became a permanent institution that continued to safeguard Britain's cultural treasures for future generations. Most importantly, The case had demonstrated that cultural preservation required more than just official policies and institutional procedures. It needed people who cared deeply enough about heritage to make personal sacrifices for the greater good. The network members had provided that care for 70 years, and their example inspired a new generation of cultural guardians who would continue their work through legal and recognized channels. In the end, what had begun as a criminal investigation had become a celebration of dedication, wisdom, and the enduring human commitment to preserving the treasures of the past for the benefit of the future. The hidden guardians had finally received the recognition they deserved, and their preserved treasures